In the spring of 1945, inside a makeshift military hospital in the ruins of what was once a proud German city, 200 officers of the SS lay in their beds, writhing in agony. Their wounds were severe, products of the final desperate battles of a collapsing Third Reich. Shrapnel had torn through limbs, bullets had shattered bones, and burns from Allied bombings had left skin charred and peeling. These men, who had once stood as the embodiment of Nazi power, now found themselves reduced to broken bodies crying out for relief. But relief never came. Instead, each injection they received brought no comfort, no numbness, no escape from the screaming pain. The morphine they desperately needed had been replaced with something else entirely, plain water. And the woman responsible for their suffering moved through the wards with the calm efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Her name was never supposed to be remembered. She was simply one nurse among dozens, a face in a white uniform lost in the chaos of a war that was finally mercifully coming to an end. She had watched the Nazi regime rise from its earliest days, had seen neighbors disappear in the night, had witnessed the transformation of her country into a machine of industrial murder. She had kept her head down, played the role expected of her, and survived. But survival had come at a cost that festered in her chest like an infected wound. Every smile she forced for SS officers, every bandage she carefully wrapped around the hands that had signed deportation orders, every kind word she spoke to men who had participated in atrocities beyond comprehension, it all built inside her like pressure in a sealed container. And on one particular morning in April, as she prepared the medication cart for her rounds, something inside her finally snapped. The decision was not made in a moment of blind rage or sudden impulse. She had been planning it for weeks, perhaps months, calculating the risk and weighing the consequences. The hospital was understaffed, the chain of command fractured, and the Allied forces were closing in from all sides. Germany was bleeding out, and in that chaos, who would notice if the morphine supplies ran a little shorter than expected? Who would question a dedicated nurse who had never once given anyone reason to doubt her competence or her loyalty? She began slowly at first, replacing just a few vials, testing to see if anyone would catch on. When no alarm was raised, when no superior questioned the inventory, she grew bolder. Soon, entire bottles of morphine were being siphoned away and replaced with sterile saline solution. The real medication she hid carefully, saving it for the patients who deserved it, the forced laborers, the political prisoners, the civilians caught in the crossfire of a war they never wanted. The SS officers never suspected a thing. How could they? They were accustomed to being served, to having their needs prioritized above all others. Even in defeat, even as their 1,000-year Reich crumbled around them, they expected deference and care. When the injections failed to dull their pain, they blamed the quality of wartime medical supplies or the severity of their injuries. Some cursed the incompetence of military logistics. Others simply gritted their teeth and endured, believing themselves to be demonstrating the Nordic fortitude their ideology had always championed. None of them considered that the nurse moving between their beds, checking pulses and adjusting pillows with practiced gentleness, might be the architect of their torment. None of them imagined that this quiet woman had decided they would feel every shattered nerve, every torn muscle, every moment of the suffering they had inflicted on millions. The hospital itself was a monument to the contradictions of the Nazi collapse. Outside its walls, the city burned under Allied bombardment. Inside, the regime's elite still clung to the illusion of order and privilege. The wards reserved for SS officers received what little remained of clean linens and proper medical equipment, while in the basement and back rooms, prisoners of war and forced laborers lay on bare floors with untreated wounds. This hierarchy persisted, even as the sounds of Soviet and American artillery grew closer each day, even as the staff began whispering about escape routes and false papers. The system that had defined Nazi Germany, the brutal categorization of human beings into those who mattered and those who did not, continued to function right up until the moment the walls came down. But in one crucial way, in one small corner of this dying empire, the hierarchy had been secretly inverted. What drove her to this act of calculated cruelty disguised as mercy? Was it justice, revenge, or something more complex? a desperate attempt to reclaim her own humanity by denying comfort to those who had stolen it from others? The answer lies in understanding who she was before the war, what she witnessed during it, and the specific moment when a healer decided that some wounds deserved to remain open and screaming. This is the story of a woman whose name history almost forgot, and the 200 men who suffered at her hands in the final days of the Third Reich. This is the story of when mercy became a weapon, and silence became an act of resistance. Her name was Inge, and before the war transformed her into an instrument of retribution, she had been exactly what the Third Reich claimed to celebrate, a model German citizen. Born in 1918 in a small Bavarian town where everyone knew everyone else's business, she grew up in the aftermath of the First Great War, in a Germany humiliated by defeat and crushed by economic desperation. Her father had been a pharmacist, a respected man who taught her about medicines and their properties, from the time she could read the labels on bottles. Her mother had been a devout Lutheran who believed in service to others, in the fundamental Christian duty to heal the sick and comfort the suffering. Inge absorbed both lessons completely, and when she turned 18, she enrolled in nursing school with the genuine belief that her life's purpose was to ease pain wherever she found it. She graduated top of her class in 1938, just as Germany was beginning its transformation from a wounded nation into something far more dangerous. The changes came gradually at first, then all at once. The hospital where she took her first position had Jewish doctors on staff when she arrived, talented physicians who had been treating patients in that facility for decades. Within 6 months they were gone, their licenses revoked, their practices dissolved, their presence erased as if they had never existed. Inge watched colleagues she respected lose everything, watched families she had known since childhood pack their belongings and disappear into the night, headed for borders that were closing faster than most realized. She said nothing. What could she say that would not mark her as an enemy of the state? What protest could she offer that would not end her career and possibly her life? So she kept her head down and continued working, telling herself that she could do more good by remaining in her position than by throwing her life away on futile gestures. It was the same bargain millions of Germans made with themselves during those years, the same silent collaboration that allowed the machinery of genocide to function smoothly. By 1942, the hospital had been converted to primarily serve military personnel, and the nature of Inge's work shifted dramatically. The patients were no longer the farmers and shopkeepers of her region, but soldiers returning from the Eastern Front with wounds that spoke of unimaginable brutality. She treated frostbite so severe that fingers and toes fell off like dead twigs. She cleaned bullet wounds and shrapnel injuries, while men screamed about things they had seen in occupied territories, about villages burned and populations liquidated. Some spoke in their morphine-induced delirium about the special action groups, about mass graves and mobile killing units, about orders to shoot civilians including women and children. Inge heard these confessions in the dark hours of night shifts, these fever dream admissions that painted a picture of what was really happening in the occupied East. And still she said nothing. Still she bandaged and medicated and sent these men back to recover so they could return to the front and continue the work of the Reich. Then came the moment that changed everything, the incident that transformed silent complicity into active resistance. In the winter of 1943, a transport of prisoners arrived at the hospital. Concentration camp inmates who had been deemed valuable enough to save, skilled workers whose labor was still needed by the war machine. They were skeletal, diseased, barely human in appearance after months of deliberate starvation and abuse. Inge was assigned to treat several of them, and among this group was a woman close to her own age, a Polish teacher who had been imprisoned for the crime of educating children in her native language. The woman's arm had become infected from forced labor in a munitions factory, and without treatment, she would die of sepsis within days. Inge cleaned the wound, administered what antibiotics were available, and provided the woman with extra rations from her own supplies. For 3 days, she fought to save this prisoner's life, recognizing in her eyes a reflection of the person Inge herself might have become if circumstances had been different, if she had been born on the wrong side of the Reich's arbitrary lines of human value. On the 4th day, an SS officer arrived and removed the woman from the ward. Inge protested, explained that the patient needed at least another week of treatment to survive. The officer looked at her with something between amusement and contempt and told her not to waste resources on subhuman specimens whose value had already been extracted. The woman was taken back to the camp, and Inge learned 2 days later that she had died shortly after arrival, the infection racing through her weakened body without mercy. That night, Inge stood in the supply room among the bottles and vials of medication and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. She had spent 5 years telling herself that survival required silence, that she could do more good by continuing her work than by resisting. But what good had she actually done? How many lives had she truly saved versus how many had she merely prolonged so they could suffer more efficiently for the Reich? The question had no comfortable answer, and in the absence of comfort, rage began to grow. The transformation from obedient nurse to silent saboteur did not happen overnight, but once it began, there was no turning it back. Inge started small, with acts of defiance so subtle that even she could pretend they were accidents if discovered. She would miscalculate dosages for SS officers, giving them slightly less pain medication than prescribed, not enough to raise alarms, but enough that they felt discomfort longer than necessary. She would delay responding to their call buttons, taking an extra 5 or 10 minutes to arrive at their bedsides, claiming she had been occupied with more critical patients. She began prioritizing the forced laborers and prisoners of war who occasionally passed through the facility, slipping them extra food, better bandages, stronger antibiotics when she could manage it without detection. These small acts of redistribution felt like drops of water against a forest fire, insignificant in the grand scheme of the war, but they gave her something she had lost years ago, a sense of agency, a feeling that her hands could do something other than serve the machinery of oppression. But small acts of defiance were no longer enough to satisfy the anger that had taken root inside her. By 1944, the war had turned decisively against Germany, and the hospital began receiving a different class of patient, high-ranking SS officers wounded in the increasingly desperate defensive actions as the Allies pushed in from all sides. These were not ordinary soldiers conscripted into service. These were true believers, men who had volunteered for the most ideologically pure units of the Nazi apparatus. They wore their death's head insignia with pride, even as they lay broken in hospital beds. They spoke casually about their service in concentration camps, about actions taken in occupied territories, about the necessity of racial purification and the cleansing of Europe. Inge listened to these conversations as she changed their dressings and monitored their vital signs, and with each passing day, the disparity between their attitudes and their circumstances became more obscene. Here were men responsible for industrial-scale murder, now demanding compassionate care and pain relief as if it were their natural right. The final catalyst came in March of 1945, when a particular SS officer arrived at the facility. He was a mid-level commander who had been wounded during the Soviet advance through Poland, and he was unusually talkative during his treatment, perhaps because the morphine loosened his tongue, or perhaps because he simply did not see nurses as fully human and therefore felt no need to guard his words around them. He spoke with bureaucratic pride about his efficiency in liquidating a ghetto, about the logistical challenges of processing thousands of people through killing operations, about the amusing resistance some prisoners had shown before their inevitable deaths. He spoke about these things the way another man might discuss a difficult but ultimately successful business project. Inge nodded politely, adjusted his IV drip, and felt something crystallize in her mind with perfect clarity. This man was experiencing more medical care and pain management in this single hospital stay than the thousands he had murdered had received in their entire final months of life. The injustice of it was so profound, so complete, that it demanded correction. That night, Inge stayed late after her shift ended, claiming she needed to complete some paperwork and inventory checks. The hospital was operating with a skeleton staff, most of the senior administrators having already fled westward ahead of the advancing Soviet forces. Supply management had become chaotic as the Reich's infrastructure collapsed, with medications arriving irregularly and record-keeping becoming increasingly haphazard. In this environment of institutional decay, Inge realized she had an opportunity that would never come again. She moved through the supply room with steady hands, identifying every bottle and vial of morphine in the facility's possession. She knew exactly how much they had, knew the expected consumption rate for the current patient load, knew how long she could sustain her plan before the deception became mathematically impossible to hide. She calculated that she had perhaps 3 weeks, maybe 4 if she was careful, before the collapse of the German military would render the entire question moot. She began the substitution that night, working methodically to replace morphine with sterile saline solution in identical vials. The real morphine she hid in a separate location, a storage closet that had been forgotten in the chaos of the hospital's recent reorganization. She would use those precious supplies for patients who deserved them: the forced laborers, the prisoners of war, the civilian casualties of Allied bombing raids who had never asked for this war and never supported the regime that had brought it upon them. For the SS officers, for the men who wore the symbols of genocide on their collars and spoke casually of mass murder, there would be only water. They would feel everything. Every nerve screaming, every bone grinding, every wound burning without relief. And Inge would move among them with the same professional calm she had always displayed, asking about their pain levels, nodding sympathetically at their complaints, and injecting them with absolutely nothing that would help. The first week of the deception passed with an ease that almost frightened Inge with its simplicity. She had expected paranoia, constant fear of discovery, sleepless nights replaying every moment of her carefully orchestrated substitutions. Instead, she found a strange calm settling over her, a sense of rightness that came from finally aligning her actions with her conscience after years of compromise. The SS officers received their injections on schedule, and when the medication failed to provide the expected relief, they reacted exactly as she had predicted. They complained about the declining quality of wartime pharmaceuticals, cursed the incompetence of military supply chains, and demanded larger doses to compensate for what they assumed was diluted or degraded morphine. Inge nodded with appropriate concern, made notations in their charts, and administered increased volumes of sterile water directly into their veins. The more they hurt, the more they received, and the more they received, the more they continued to hurt in an exquisite cycle of frustrated expectation. What surprised her most was how visible their suffering became once she knew to look for it, once she stopped automatically assuming that their medication was working as intended. The SS officers had been trained to project strength, to embody the superhuman ideal of Nordic warriors that Nazi ideology celebrated. But pain stripped away ideology and revealed the simple mammalian reality beneath. She watched grown men weep when they thought no one was looking, watched them bite through leather straps during wound cleanings, watched them regress to childlike states of fear and desperation when faced with the prospect of another sleepless night of unrelenting agony. Some began refusing treatments altogether, preferring to let their wounds fester rather than endure the pain of debridement and dressing changes. Others became violent, lashing out at staff members in their frustration, creating disciplinary problems that further distracted the already overwhelmed hospital administration from noticing any irregularities in medication efficacy. The psychological dynamics of the ward shifted in fascinating ways that Inge had not anticipated. The SS officers, accustomed to absolute authority and immediate obedience, found themselves completely powerless in the face of physical suffering that would not yield to commands or ideology. Some tried to bribe her with promises of protection when the Allies arrived, offering to testify on her behalf if she would only give them real pain relief. Others threatened her with consequences once Germany won the war, though by April of 1945, these threats rang hollow even to those making them, desperate fantasies voiced by men watching their world collapse. A few seemed to achieve a kind of dark enlightenment through their suffering, becoming quiet and introspective, perhaps experiencing for the first time in their lives a suffering they could not blame on inferior races or political enemies. But most simply suffered without understanding, without growth, without any redemptive transformation. They hurt, and they hated hurting, and they demanded that someone fix it just as they had always demanded that the world conform to their expectations. Meanwhile, in other sections of the hospital, Inge's hidden stockpile of real morphine was being used exactly as she had intended. A French prisoner of war with gangrene received enough pain relief to sleep through the night before his leg was amputated. A Polish forced laborer crushed in a factory accident spent her final hours in relative peace rather than screaming agony. A German civilian woman whose home had been destroyed by Allied bombing and who had lost 3 children in the attack received enough medication to endure the psychological trauma without complete mental breakdown. These patients never knew why their care was better than the official supply situation should have allowed. They never knew that their relief came at the direct expense of the SS officers in the adjacent wing. They simply experienced mercy in a time and place where mercy had become the rarest of commodities, and Inge found more satisfaction in their peaceful expressions than in all the years of professional recognition she had received before the war. By the end of the 2nd week, Inge had established a routine so smooth that it felt almost mundane. She would arrive for her shift, check on the SS officers, and document their continued complaints about ineffective medication, administer their scheduled injections of saline solution, and then slip away during quieter moments to treat her secret patients with actual pharmaceutical relief. The other nurses noticed that she seemed more energized lately, more engaged with her work, despite the increasingly desperate military situation outside the hospital walls. Some attributed it to the proximity of the war's end, assuming she was simply relieved that the nightmare would soon be over. Others thought perhaps she had received good news about family members or had found some source of hope in the general despair. None of them guessed the truth, that Inge had discovered a way to practice medicine that finally felt like healing rather than collaboration, that she had found a method to redistribute suffering toward those who had earned it and away from those who had not. The 3rd week brought complications that tested Inge's nerve in ways she had not fully prepared for. One of the SS officers, a colonel who had been recovering from severe burns sustained in a Soviet flamethrower attack, began to deteriorate rapidly. His pain had become so unbearable, so constant and all-consuming, that he stopped eating entirely, and his body began to fail from the combined stress of untreated agony and malnutrition. The medical staff held a consultation about his case, debating whether his medication regimen needed to be adjusted or if perhaps he was experiencing some unusual reaction to his injuries. Inge stood in that meeting room, listening to her colleagues puzzle over a mystery she had created, and felt the weight of what she was doing settle on her shoulders with new heaviness. This was not abstract justice anymore. This was a specific human being disintegrating before her eyes, and her hands held the power to stop it. For nearly an hour after that meeting, she stood in the supply closet staring at the hidden bottles of real morphine, genuinely uncertain whether she would break her own rule and provide him relief. She did not break. The decision came down to a simple question that cut through all moral complexity. Did this man deserve more compassion than the people he had helped murder? The colonel's medical file included his service record, and Inge had read it thoroughly. He had commanded an SS unit responsible for anti-partisan operations in Ukraine, actions that military records antiseptically described, but which everyone understood, meant the systematic burning of villages and execution of civilian populations suspected of harboring resistance fighters. The burns covering his body now were almost certainly less severe than those he had inflicted on countless others. The pain he experienced in this hospital bed was mercifully temporary compared to the permanent silence he had imposed on entire communities. Inge closed the supply closet door, locked it, and returned to the ward where she administered another injection of sterile water to the colonel, while he begged her through cracked lips for something stronger. She told him gently that he was already receiving the maximum safe dosage, and that she would pray for his recovery. The incident crystallized something important for Inge. She was not merely withholding medication, she was actively choosing who deserved relief and who deserved suffering, playing a role she had never imagined herself capable of playing. In a strange inversion of the Nazi ideology that had dominated her adult life, she had created her own hierarchy of human value, her own system for determining whose pain mattered and whose did not. The difference, she told herself during the long nights when sleep would not come, was that her system was based on actions and choices rather than accidents of birth. These SS officers had volunteered for their positions, had embraced an ideology of extermination, had participated willingly in crimes that exceeded the capacity of language to fully describe. If anyone in this hospital deserved to feel the full weight of their wounds without chemical comfort, it was men who had inflicted infinitely worse on millions who had done nothing to earn such treatment. But even as she rehearsed these justifications, she recognized the dangerous territory she was walking. Deciding who deserves to suffer is precisely what had led Germany down its dark path in the first place. The hospital itself was approaching its final days of operation, though most of the staff tried not to acknowledge this reality too directly. The sounds of artillery had grown close enough that the building shook with each impact, and plaster dust drifted down from the ceilings like toxic snow. Supply deliveries had stopped entirely, meaning Inge's deception was becoming moot. There would be no more morphine arriving to replace what she had hidden, and eventually the hidden supply itself would run out. Patients who could be moved were being evacuated westward ahead of the Soviet advance, though the SS officers remained behind due to the severity of their injuries or because they had nowhere to go in a Germany that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The hospital had become a strange island of suspended time, a place where the hierarchies and ideologies of the Third Reich continued to function even as the state itself dissolved into chaos and ash. In this liminal space between one world ending and another beginning, Inge continued her rounds with mechanical precision, maintaining the fiction of normal medical care in profoundly abnormal circumstances. By the middle of the fourth week, Inge had settled into a kind of grim acceptance of what she was doing and what it meant. She was not a hero rescuing innocent victims. Most of her patients were beyond rescuing, and her actions changed nothing about the fundamental trajectory of the war or the ultimate fate of the Nazi regime. She was not administering justice in any legal or systematic sense. There would be no trials, no documentation, no official recognition of crimes and punishments. What she was doing was simpler and more primal than either heroism or justice. She was evening a scale in the only way available to her, using the small power her position granted, to ensure that for once, for a brief moment in history, the perpetrators of suffering experienced a fraction of what they had inflicted. Whether this made her a righteous avenger or simply another person corrupted by the moral void of total war was a question she no longer had the luxury of contemplating. The Soviets would arrive within days, and when they did, everything would change again in ways no one could predict. The arrival of the Red Army was announced not by official communication, but by the sudden silence of German artillery, followed by the distinctive sound of Soviet tank engines rumbling through streets that had been reduced to rubble. It was the 21st of April, 1945, and the hospital staff had perhaps 2 hours of warning before Soviet soldiers would push through the doors and take control of the facility. In that narrow window of chaos, the institutional structures that had governed the hospital for years simply evaporated. Senior administrators fled out back entrances, destroying records and changing into civilian clothes as they ran. Guards abandoned their posts. The carefully maintained separation between SS wards and prisoner wards became meaningless as everyone understood that new authorities were about to impose an entirely different order on this space. Inge watched this disintegration with a strange sense of calm, knowing that her secret would soon become irrelevant, that the suffering she had inflicted would be subsumed into the much larger accounting of crimes and punishments that the occupation would bring. She did not flee. While other staff members gathered their belongings and slipped away into the chaos of the collapsing city, Inge remained at her post and continued preparing for the arrival of the new patients she knew would be coming. Wounded Soviet soldiers who would need the same care she had been providing to their enemies. She moved through the supply room one final time, retrieving the hidden bottles of morphine and placing them back among the official medical supplies where they belonged. There was no longer any reason to maintain the deception, no longer any point in distinguishing between deserving and undeserving patients. The war that had created the moral framework for her actions was ending, and with it, the terrible clarity that had allowed her to become an agent of suffering rather than relief. She found herself feeling an unexpected sadness at this transition, not because she regretted what she had done, but because returning to normal medicine meant returning to a world where she would once again be complicit in systems she could not control, where her small acts of resistance would be replaced by professional obligation and institutional hierarchy. When the Soviet soldiers finally entered the hospital, they did so with weapons raised and suspicion etched on faces hardened by years of brutal warfare. They had liberated concentration camps in Poland and seen the evidence of industrial genocide. They had fought through countries where civilian populations had been systematically starved and worked to death. They arrived expecting to find Nazi war criminals hiding among the patients, and they were not wrong. The SS officers who had been suffering under Inge's care suddenly found themselves facing a different kind of judgment entirely. Soviet commissars moved through the wards, checking papers and insignia, separating ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers from SS personnel with swift and brutal efficiency. The screams that filled the hospital that afternoon had nothing to do with untreated wounds, and everything to do with the rough justice of soldiers who had no patience for legal niceties or medical protection of enemy combatants. Inge watched several of her patients dragged from their beds and taken away to fates she could only imagine, and felt neither satisfaction nor guilt, only a profound exhaustion. In the confusion of the occupation's first hours, one of the Soviet medical officers approached Inge and asked through a translator about the hospital's medication supplies and patient conditions. She provided accurate information about what resources remained and which patients required immediate attention, falling easily back into the professional role that had defined her adult life. The Soviet officer seemed impressed by her competence and calm demeanor in circumstances that had left most of the remaining staff paralyzed with fear. He asked if she would be willing to continue working under the new administration, helping to treat both Soviet wounded and whatever German patients were deemed worthy of care. Inge agreed without hesitation, understanding that her value as a skilled nurse would provide protection in the dangerous days ahead, when occupation authorities would be sorting the population into categories of collaborator, bystander, and resistance. She did not mention her months of sabotage. She did not confess to the systematic denial of pain relief to 200 SS officers. She simply returned to being what she had always appeared to be, a competent, compassionate medical professional doing her best in impossible circumstances. The SS officers who remained in the hospital after the Soviet sorting represented those too wounded to move or too low-ranking to be worth the effort of immediate arrest. They were perhaps 40 men out of the original 200, and Inge found herself assigned to their care under the supervision of Soviet medical personnel who had no interest in providing comfort to Nazi soldiers, but understood the propaganda value of demonstrating Soviet superiority through correct medical treatment. For the first time in a month, Inge administered real morphine to these patients, watching their expressions shift from constant agony to the slack peace of pharmaceutical relief. Some thanked her with desperate gratitude, unaware that she was the source of the suffering they had endured. Others were too far gone in pain and trauma to recognize the change. As she moved through this final round of care, Inge realized that her act of resistance had left no permanent mark, had changed nothing about the ultimate trajectory of these men's lives or the accounting of crimes that would follow the war's end. But it had changed her, had proven to herself that she was capable of more than passive survival, and that knowledge would have to be enough. The full scope of what Inge had done remained hidden for nearly 3 weeks after the Soviet occupation, buried beneath the chaos of a city struggling to establish new order from complete collapse. The hospital continued to function in a strange hybrid state, with Soviet medical personnel working alongside the German staff who had chosen or been compelled to remain. Patients arrived in waves, Red Army soldiers wounded in the final pushes westward, German civilians injured in the bombardment and street fighting, and a steady stream of liberated prisoners from nearby labor camps who were in such advanced states of starvation and disease that many died within hours of arrival, despite all efforts to save them. In this environment of overwhelming medical crisis, no one had time to investigate why SS officers had suffered unusually during the final weeks of German control. Their complaints were dismissed as the exaggerations of defeated soldiers seeking sympathy they had not earned, and the matter seemed destined to disappear into the larger narrative of the war's end. But one man refused to let it go. His name was Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner, a former SS captain who had survived his wounds and Soviet interrogation due to his willingness to provide detailed testimony about his unit's activities in exchange for more lenient treatment. Steiner had been one of Inge's patients during the month of substituted morphine, and his experience of unexplained suffering had left him with an obsessive need to understand what had happened. Unlike many of his fellow officers, Steiner had medical training from before the war. He had been a veterinary student before joining the SS, and he understood enough about pharmacology to know that morphine did not simply stop working because supply chains were disrupted. In the strange freedom that came from having already betrayed his comrades and having nothing left to lose, Steiner began conducting his own investigation, speaking quietly with other former patients and comparing their experiences during those final weeks. What Steiner discovered was a pattern too consistent to be coincidental. Every SS officer in the hospital during late March and April had experienced the same phenomenon: injections that provided no relief, pain that never diminished despite increased dosages, and a level of suffering that seemed disproportionate to their injuries when compared to Wehrmacht soldiers treated during the same period. He began watching Inge carefully during her rounds, noting the calm efficiency with which she worked, the professional detachment that never cracked even when treating patients who cursed her or grabbed her arms in desperation. There was something in her manner that struck him as performance rather than genuine care, a quality he recognized because he had spent years performing loyalty to an ideology while harboring his own private doubts and fears. Steiner understood masks because he had worn them himself, and he became convinced that the nurse who moved through the wards with such practiced compassion was hiding something that would explain the mystery of their collective suffering. The confrontation came on a grey morning in early May, as Inge was preparing medication in the supply room. Steiner appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on a cane and blocking her exit. He did not threaten her or raise his voice. Instead, he spoke with the weary curiosity of someone who simply needed to know the truth before whatever came next in his ruined life. He told her about his investigation, about the pattern he had discovered, about his growing certainty that their pain had not been an accident of wartime supply problems, but something more deliberate. He asked her directly if she had substituted the morphine and offered her a devil's bargain. If she confirmed his suspicion, he would tell no one, would take the knowledge to whatever fate awaited him, because he had come to believe that perhaps they had deserved exactly what they received. He wanted only the satisfaction of having his theory validated, of knowing that his suffering had meaning, rather than being random cruelty of a chaotic universe. Inge stood in that supply room, looking at this broken man who had once embodied the power of the regime and now had nothing left except the need to understand his own pain, and made a calculation about risk and truth. She could deny everything, maintain her cover of innocent competence, and let Steiner take his suspicions to the grave, or she could acknowledge what she had done, trusting that a man who had already betrayed his entire unit to save himself would keep one more secret if it suited his purposes. She chose truth, not out of any desire for confession or absolution, but because she recognized in Steiner's eyes something she had felt herself, the desperate need to impose meaning on suffering, to believe that pain served some purpose beyond mere chaos. She told him yes, she had replaced the morphine with saline solution, and she had done it deliberately for every SS officer under her care. She told him about the Polish teacher who had died, about the years of silent complicity, about the moment when she decided that she would use the only power she possessed to redistribute suffering toward those who had earned it. Steiner listened to her confession without interruption, his expression shifting through a complex series of emotions that settled finally into something resembling grim acceptance. When she finished speaking, he was silent for a long moment, leaning against the doorframe as if the weight of confirmation had added physical burden to his already damaged body. Then he did something Inge had not expected. He laughed, a short, bitter sound without any humor in it. He told her that he appreciated the irony of the situation, that the SS had spent years inflicting suffering according to their ideological calculations of human worth, and here was a single nurse who had turned that same logic against them, using nothing more sophisticated than sterile water and professional deception. He said that if their positions had been reversed, if he had been the one with power over her pain, he would have done far worse than simply withhold medication. He would have used her suffering as entertainment, as he had seen done to prisoners countless times, and the fact that she had merely allowed them to feel their wounds without relief was almost merciful by comparison. But then his expression darkened, and he issued a warning that carried the weight of genuine concern. He told Inge that she had made a fundamental mistake in her execution of justice. She had left witnesses. 200 SS officers had passed through her care during that month, and while many had died or been executed or transported east to Soviet prison camps, enough remained in the city that eventually someone would make the connections he had made. The war might be over, but the reckoning was just beginning, and in that reckoning the Allies and Soviets would be looking very carefully at anyone who had worked in facilities that served high-ranking Nazis. If it became known that she had deliberately caused suffering to patients in her care, the nuance of her moral reasoning would be lost. She would be classified as someone who had violated medical ethics, who had betrayed the fundamental trust between patient and healer, and that classification would not distinguish between her targets and the victims she had helped. Steiner advised her to disappear, to take advantage of the chaos and reinvent herself somewhere far from this city where no one knew her face or her history. Inge considered his advice seriously, understanding the logic behind it. The post-war world was already dividing itself into simple categories of perpetrator and victim, collaborator and resistor, and there would be little room for complicated truths about nurses who had committed acts of calculated cruelty against war criminals. But she also recognized that fleeing would mean abandoning the only identity she had ever known, giving up the profession that had defined her since adolescence, and starting over in circumstances where skilled medical personnel were desperately needed, but also carefully scrutinized. More than that, fleeing would mean accepting that what she had done was shameful, something to hide and deny, rather than an act of resistance against an evil system. She told Steiner that she would not run, that she would continue her work and accept whatever consequences came from her choices, because she had spent too many years in silent complicity and would not return to that state of moral invisibility now that the opportunity for honesty had finally arrived. Steiner shrugged and said it was her decision to make, and that he would keep his word about remaining silent regarding what she had told him. He left the supply room and Inge never spoke with him again. Within a week he had been transferred to a Soviet interrogation facility further east, and his ultimate fate remained unknown to her. But his warning proved prophetic in ways that began to manifest almost immediately. Other former SS officers still in the city started asking questions about their treatment during the final weeks of the war, comparing notes and building toward the same conclusions Steiner had reached. A Soviet investigator, conducting routine interviews with hospital staff as part of the occupation's documentation efforts, noted inconsistencies in the morphine supply records and asked Inge to explain the discrepancies. She provided technically accurate answers about the chaos of the period and the breakdown of normal inventory procedures, but she could see in the investigator's eyes that her explanations were being measured against some internal standard of plausibility and found wanting. The situation reached its crisis point on the 15th of May, when Inge was formally summoned to appear before a Soviet administrative tribunal investigating potential war crimes and collaboration. The summons did not specify charges, but it referenced her position at the hospital during the final month of German control and requested detailed testimony about the treatment of SS personnel under her care. Inge understood that she was approaching a threshold moment. Depending on how she testified, she could either protect herself through careful omissions and plausible deniability, or she could tell the complete truth and accept whatever judgment followed. She had approximately 18 hours before her scheduled appearance to decide which version of herself she would present to the authorities, which story she would tell about the nurse who had replaced morphine with water and watched 200 men suffer without relief. The choice would determine not just her immediate fate, but the meaning she would assign to her actions for whatever remained of her life after this war that had transformed everyone it touched. Inge appeared before the Soviet tribunal at exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, wearing her cleanest nurse's uniform and carrying a small folder containing what remained of the hospital's medication records from the period in question. The tribunal consisted of 3 officers: a Soviet military judge, a political commissar, and a doctor from the Red Army Medical Corps who would evaluate the technical aspects of her testimony. The room was sparse and cold, a former municipal office that still bore the scars of recent combat, with bullet holes in the walls and windows covered with boards rather than glass. Inge sat in a wooden chair facing the three men and felt a strange absence of fear. She had spent weeks imagining this moment, rehearsing various versions of her testimony, but now that it had arrived, she discovered that she was simply tired of carrying the weight of her secret and ready for whatever consequences would follow its release. The questioning began methodically, with the Soviet doctor asking her to describe the hospital's normal procedures for pain management and morphine distribution during the period of German control. Inge answered accurately, explaining the theoretical protocols that should have governed medication use, and acknowledging that the chaos of the war's final weeks had made strict adherence to those protocols increasingly difficult. The doctor nodded and consulted his notes, then asked her to explain specific discrepancies in the supply records, instances where morphine consumption appeared lower than would be expected, given the number and severity of patients being treated. This was the moment where Inge could have offered the careful lies she had prepared, could have blamed administrative confusion and incomplete record-keeping in the face of institutional collapse. Instead, she told them the truth. She explained that she had systematically replaced morphine with saline solution for SS officers under her care, that she had done so deliberately over the course of approximately 4 weeks, and that her actions had resulted in those patients experiencing their wounds without pharmaceutical pain relief. The room fell silent after her confession, the three officers exchanging glances that communicated surprise at her directness. The political commissar leaned forward and asked the obvious question: why had she done this? What had motivated her to violate her medical responsibilities in such a specific and targeted way? Inge had anticipated this question and had prepared an answer that balanced honesty with strategic self-presentation. She told them about the Polish teacher, who had died after being removed from her care, about the years of watching Nazi crimes unfold while being forced to provide comfort to their perpetrators, about the fundamental injustice of using scarce medical resources to ease the suffering of men who had inflicted far worse on millions of innocent people. She did not present herself as a hero or a member of any organized resistance. She described her actions as a personal moral decision made in extraordinary circumstances, an attempt to impose some small measure of proportional justice in a system designed to reward criminals and punish victims. The Soviet doctor asked whether she understood that what she had done constituted a violation of medical ethics, that the principles of healing were supposed to apply universally, regardless of a patient's political affiliation or moral character. Inge acknowledged this directly, saying yes, she understood that she had betrayed the fundamental covenant between healer and patient, and that under normal circumstances, such a betrayal would be unforgivable. But these had not been normal circumstances. The men she had denied pain relief were not ordinary patients but active participants in a genocidal regime, and the morphine she withheld from them had been used instead to provide comfort to their victims. She asked the tribunal to consider whether medical ethics developed in peacetime could be applied without modification to situations where the entire social order had been corrupted by systematic evil. She was not arguing that her actions were right in any absolute sense, but that they occupied a moral category that simple condemnation or approval could not adequately address. The military judge, who had been silent throughout most of the questioning, finally spoke. He asked Inge what she thought should happen to her now, what punishment or consequence she believed would be appropriate for what she had done. It was a strange question, one that seemed to invert the normal relationship between tribunal and accused, and Inge realized that these Soviet officers were genuinely uncertain about how to categorize her actions within their frameworks of justice and accountability. She told them that she did not know what punishment would be appropriate, that she had acted according to her conscience, but understood that conscience alone could not justify violations of professional duty. She said that she would accept their judgment, whatever it might be, but that she would not apologize for the specific choices she had made or pretend that she regretted denying comfort to men who had shown no mercy to others. She had crossed a line that should not normally be crossed, but the circumstances themselves had been abnormal, in ways that made traditional moral calculations inadequate. The tribunal adjourned without rendering an immediate decision, telling Inge that she would be notified of their determination within 3 days, and that she should remain available for further questioning if needed. She left the building and walked back to the hospital through streets still littered with rubble and marked by the evidence of recent combat, uncertain whether she would be arrested, dismissed from her position, or simply allowed to continue her work as if the confession had never happened. The waiting period that followed was surreal. She continued treating patients, administering medications with the same professional care she had always shown, while knowing that her entire future hung in balance based on how 3 Soviet officers would interpret her deliberate infliction of suffering on enemy combatants. She discovered that confession, rather than bringing relief or closure, had simply transformed her uncertainty from a private burden into an official proceeding, and that the judgment of institutions carried different weight than the judgment of her own conscience. The tribunal's decision arrived on the 3rd day exactly as promised, delivered by a young Soviet lieutenant who found Inge in the hospital's recovery ward, changing bandages on a German civilian who had lost both legs in the final artillery bombardments. The envelope he handed her contained a single page of typed text in Russian, with a German translation attached. The ruling was brief and deliberately ambiguous in its moral assessment. The tribunal acknowledged that Inge had violated medical protocols and betrayed the trust inherent in patient care, but it also recognized that her actions had been directed exclusively against members of an organization, the SS, that stood accused of crimes against humanity on a scale that existing legal frameworks struggled to comprehend. The decision stated that in consideration of the extraordinary circumstances of total war and systematic genocide, and in recognition of her continued service to all patients regardless of nationality or affiliation since the Soviet occupation, no criminal charges would be filed against her. However, her actions would be noted in her official record, and she would be prohibited from holding any supervisory medical position for a period of 5 years. She could continue working as a nurse, but always under the direct oversight of others who had not compromised their professional ethics, even in the face of moral extremity. Inge read the decision twice, trying to understand whether it represented vindication or condemnation, and ultimately concluded that it was neither. The Soviets had simply chosen a pragmatic path that acknowledged complexity without resolving it, that allowed her to continue being useful, while marking her as someone who had crossed boundaries that most had managed to respect. In the months and years that followed, this ambiguous status would define her post-war existence. She worked in hospitals throughout occupied Germany and later in the divided city of Berlin, always competent and always under supervision, treated by colleagues with a mixture of respect for her skills and unease about her history. Some saw her as a hero who had resisted the Nazis in the only way available to her. Others viewed her as someone who had allowed ideology to corrupt the fundamental principles of healing. Most simply avoided thinking too deeply about the implications of her case, preferring to focus on the overwhelming work of rebuilding a shattered society. The 200 SS officers who had suffered under her care scattered to various fates as the post-war order solidified. Many died in Soviet prison camps, or were executed after trials that barely mentioned the individual details of their service. Some survived and returned to Germany, where they lived quiet lives under assumed names or in communities that chose not to ask too many questions about wartime activities. A handful were prosecuted in the major war crimes trials, where their testimony about various atrocities made no mention of a nurse who had denied them morphine, that suffering was too personal and too small to matter in proceedings documenting industrial-scale murder. None of them ever publicly identified Inge or sought any form of revenge or justice for what she had done to them. Perhaps they understood that drawing attention to their own suffering would invite questions about what they had done to deserve such treatment. Perhaps they simply wanted to forget that month of unexplained agony, along with everything else about the war's brutal conclusion. Inge herself lived until 1998, dying at the age of 80, in a modest apartment in what had become reunified Berlin. She never married, never had children, and spent her entire adult life working in medical settings where pain and its relief remained constant concerns. In her final years, as Germany grappled with new generations of questions about guilt and responsibility and the moral choices available to ordinary people under extraordinary evil, a few journalists and historians discovered her story and sought interviews. She granted some of these requests, but always with careful boundaries around what she would discuss. She confirmed the basic facts. Yes, she had replaced morphine with water. Yes, she had done so deliberately. Yes, she understood the ethical violations her actions represented. But she refused to frame her choices in the heroic terms some interviewers preferred, and she equally refused to express the remorse others seemed to expect. She had done what she believed necessary in circumstances that offered no good options, and she had lived with the consequences without seeking either absolution or martyrdom. The question of whether Inge was right or wrong, hero or criminal, has never been definitively answered because it exists in moral territory where such definitive answers may be impossible. She took the principle that had governed Nazi Germany, that some human beings deserve suffering, while others deserve protection, and inverted it, using the same logic against those who had created and enforced it. In doing so, she became both an agent of resistance and someone who violated the fundamental ethics of her profession. She saved morphine for victims and denied it to perpetrators, redistributing mercy in a world that had forgotten its meaning. The 200 SS officers who suffered under her care experienced a fraction of the pain they had inflicted on others, and whether that constituted justice or simply another layer of cruelty depends entirely on which principles one believes should govern human behavior, even in the midst of genocidal war. History has not forgotten her, but neither has it known quite what to do with her memory, and perhaps that ambiguity is the most honest assessment possible. What remains undeniable is that in the spring of 1945, one woman with access to a supply closet and the courage to act on her convictions demonstrated that even in the most totalitarian systems, even when institutional power appears absolute, individual resistance remains possible. Her resistance took the form of withheld comfort rather than dramatic sabotage, of silent substitution rather than open rebellion, but it was resistance nonetheless. She used the small power granted to her by her professional role to ensure that for once, the perpetrators rather than the victims bore the weight of unrelieved suffering. Whether this makes her story one of heroism, or moral compromise, inspiration or warning, is a judgment that each person must make based on their own understanding of ethics, justice, and the impossible choices that emerge when civilization collapses into barbarism. But the story itself, of the nurse who replaced morphine with water and watched 200 SS officers suffer without relief, stands as a reminder that even in the darkest periods of human history, individuals retain the capacity to choose which side of the line between victim and perpetrator they will occupy, and that sometimes the most profound acts of resistance are the ones that leave no monuments and demand no recognition, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that in one small corner of hell, the accounts were briefly, brutally balanced,